The vast majority of my colleagues consider insulin resistance to be a disease state. And I guess it's easy to see why, because it's associated with having too much fat, which in itself is now classified as a disease, quite bizarrely, and sits alongside type 2 diabetes and the so-called metabolic syndrome. But merely because this association exists, it doesn't mean that insulin resistance is abnormal. My hypothesis is that in fact it's a normal homeostatic mechanism which, like all systems and processes in the body, has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years and exists to ensure that we survive. To work out why things are as they are in the human body today, one has to simply imagine how primitive man existed. Beyond looking for his food and protecting his family, he really didn't have much else to do. He certainly didn't need to go to work or do the shopping or the school run. So if food was abundant, he needed a mechanism for both storing any extra that wasn't required for immediate utilization and for conserving the stuff that was stored. As far as storage is concerned, we have depots for the three macronutrients: glycogen, which is a polymer of glucose for carbohydrate, subcutaneous and visceral adipose tissue for fat, and muscle for protein. Strictly speaking, muscle was almost certainly never intended as storage, but is an important source in the event of short supply. And as discussed, having stored it, there needed to be a mechanism for conserving it, and this is exactly where insulin resistance comes in. An excess of insulin, as seen in the fed state, leads to downregulation of the insulin receptor, which limits the entry of glucose into the cell, reducing its availability in the cell and putting a brake on cellular metabolism. We also know that the presence of insulin will inhibit lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat, and thereby restrict the cell's ability to utilize this as an alternative energy substrate. So in effect, it is putting the cells and the body as a whole into a mini hibernation. If he then experienced a period where food was scarce, he needed to put his body into a state of readiness to go hunting and gathering. So insulin levels remained at zero, insulin receptors were upregulated, insulin resistance was quickly abolished, full insulin sensitivity was regained, glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, and lipolysis proceeded unhindered, glucose was allowed back into the cell, and if he exhausted the supply, then he had a ready supply of fatty acids as a backup. The cells regained their full metabolic state, and off he went. The problem that exists in present-day man is that he is always in the fed state, and therefore there is always a degree of insulin resistance. The mini-hibernation phenomenon that goes with insulin resistance explains the many symptoms that fat people experience. Physical fatigue because glucose can't get into the muscle cells, mental fatigue because it can't get into brain cells, and poor digestion because it can't get into the gut cells. Where insulin resistance becomes associated with disease is when it is taken well beyond its intended role, as we see in the typical Western diet that is loaded with refined carbohydrate taken at numerous times of the day. The pancreas is forced into supplying a constant stream of insulin in an attempt to keep the blood sugar within normal limits. And insulin resistance becomes so significant that the restriction on cellular uptake of glucose means that cellular metabolism, and hence function, is seriously impeded. This leads, for example, to poor cholesterol metabolism and simple functions such as control of blood pressure, resulting in hypercholesterolemia and hypertension respectively. And this is also the rationale for the Renault paradigm. This is insulin resistance leading to hypometabolic immune cells, resulting in disease initiation, disease progression, and repair failure. And this explains beautifully why we see so many diseases and illnesses in people who have too much fat. It's not the fat per se that is causing the disease, it's the insulin resistance that goes with it. Many of my detractors come up with the stock phrase, "Prove to me that you are right." But here's the thing, I'm not required to prove that I'm right for two very good reasons. Firstly, the concept is entirely logical, and secondly, from a practical perspective, it works. Telling me that it's rubbish is only acceptable if you can come up with an alternative hypothesis that is better. And doing more of the same does not fall into this category, because what we are currently doing is clearly not working, and in fact is leading us down a very dangerous road.